The gym had always been a place of discomfort for me, not because of the rigorous training or the sweat-stained floors, but because of the unsettling presence of my PE teacher, Mr. Carter, a man whose gaze lingered too long and whose comments always felt just a shade too personal, though never outright inappropriate. At least not in a way that I could confidently call out. It was always subtle, a brush of authority mixed with an air of something unspoken, something that made the air feel heavier. Whenever I was alone with him, something that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't quite understand, and yet, I convinced myself that I was overreacting, that I was just imagining things, until the day everything changed, until the day I found myself standing in the echoing emptiness of the school toilets, the fluorescent lights buzzing above me like a warning, the cold ceramic walls trapping me in a place I would never have willingly chosen to be had I known what was coming, had I understood the weight of the moment when Mr. Carter placed his heavy hand on my shoulder and whispered, "We need to talk," a statement so simple, yet layered with implications I didn't yet have the words to decipher, and I froze, my mind scrambling for a reason, for an escape, for something that would make sense of the sudden tension that coiled around me. But before I could respond, before I could step away, he tightened his grip, just slightly, just enough to make my heart stutter, and in that instant I knew. This wasn't normal, this wasn't routine, this was something else entirely, something I didn't want to be a part of, but I was trapped, locked in the stale-smelling room with only the sound of my own breathing filling the space between us, and I knew that whatever came next, whatever words he was about to say, would change everything, because the way he looked at me wasn't the way a teacher should look at a student, wasn't the way any adult should look at someone who trusted them, and yet, there we were, standing in that sickeningly sterile room where no one could hear me, where no one would believe me, because who would take the word of a student over a respected teacher? Who would believe that the man who coached the school's winning team, who shook hands with the principal and parents alike, could be anything other than what he appeared to be? But as he stepped closer, as his fingers brushed against the sleeve of my shirt in a way that sent ice down my spine, I realized something. I couldn't stay here, I couldn't let this moment unfold the way he wanted it to, but my feet were glued to the floor, my body betraying me as fear tangled itself around my limbs, and the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that he was smiling, as if this was just another casual conversation, as if I had no reason to be afraid, as if the growing horror in my chest was something I had imagined, something I had fabricated, because that's how they do it, isn't it? They make you question yourself, make you feel like the wrongness you sense is nothing more than a trick of your own mind. And so I stood there, my pulse roaring in my ears as he leaned in and said, "I've been meaning to talk to you about your performance in class," words that should have been innocent, should have been nothing more than a teacher's concern, but the way he said it, the way his voice dipped lower made my skin crawl, because this wasn't about my performance. This wasn't about anything academic, this was something else, and I didn't know how to stop it, didn't know how to make it go away, but before I could speak, before I could force my lips to form words that would push him back, the door swung open, the sudden sound of footsteps shattering the tension like glass, and just like that, Mr. Carter stepped away. His expression shifting seamlessly into one of casual authority, as if nothing had happened, as if I had imagined it all. And when I turned to see who had saved me, who had unknowingly interrupted something that could have gone so much further, I saw another student, oblivious to the storm they had walked into, and in that moment, as my lungs filled with shaky breath, I realized something chilling. This wasn't over, this wasn't the end, because Mr. Carter looked at me then, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, something that promised this wasn't the last time he would corner me, wasn't the last time I would feel like prey in my own school. And as I forced my shaking hands to reach for my bag, to pretend like nothing had happened, I understood with terrifying clarity that I was on borrowed time, that sooner or later he would find another opportunity, and when he did, I might not be so lucky next time, because the school toilets, with their damp walls and flickering lights, were just the beginning, just the place where I first felt the suffocating weight of fear, but not the place where it would end, because something told me Mr. Carter wasn't done with me yet, and no matter how much I wanted to believe otherwise, no matter how much I wanted to pretend that interruption had saved me, I knew the truth. He would try again, and next time I might not have a way out. The days that followed that first encounter were a blur of forced normalcy, a series of moments where I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, I had misread everything, that maybe I had let my paranoia get the best of me. but the truth clung to my skin like a second layer, impossible to shake, impossible to ignore. And no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, I could feel the way Mr. Carter's eyes followed me in the gym, in the halls, even in the moments when no words were exchanged, when I pretended not to notice him at all, and yet I could feel it, the weight of his gaze, the silent promise in his smirk whenever I walked past him, and that was when I knew. It wasn't over, it had never been over. That day in the toilets had only been the beginning, and now, he was waiting for the right moment, waiting for another chance, and it came sooner than I expected, too soon for me to prepare, too soon for me to escape. Because when practice ended late on a Friday, when the halls were empty, when most of my teammates had already filtered out, when the gym was nothing but a hollow echo of footsteps and distant voices, that was when it happened, when Mr. Carter called my name in that voice. The voice that sounded so normal to everyone else but made my stomach twist into knots, and I turned, too hesitant, too slow, because the moment our eyes met, I knew I had made a mistake, knew I should have ignored him, should have pretended not to hear. But it was too late now, too late, as he gestured towards the locker rooms and said, "Need a word with you, real quick," and my body felt frozen, my feet unwilling, my instincts screaming at me to say no, to leave, to run. But how do you refuse a teacher? How do you justify that gut-wrenching fear when you have no proof, when you have nothing but a feeling? And so, despite every nerve in my body begging me to turn the other way, I followed him into the empty locker room. The fluorescent lights flickering in a way that made my skin crawl, the distant hum of the air vent the only sound filling the silence, and as soon as the door shut behind me, I felt it, that shift, that undeniable shift in the air, and I realized something. This was a trap. I was exactly where he wanted me, exactly where I didn't want to be. And when I turned back towards the exit, towards the door that had just sealed off the rest of the world, I saw it in his expression, the way his lips curled just slightly, the way he leaned against the wall, too casual, too at ease, as if he had all the time in the world, as if he knew I wasn't going anywhere, and the way he said my name then, slow, deliberate, made my skin prickle with dread, because I had heard that tone before, had heard it that day in the toilets, and now, there was no one here to interrupt, no one here to save me, and my breath came shallow, my heart pounding against my ribs as he stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of cologne mixed with the lingering sweat from practice, and I wanted to move, wanted to push past him, but fear had my limbs locked in place, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything, but before I could react, he spoke again. His voice low, edged with something I couldn't quite name, and he said, "I've been watching you." Words that made my stomach drop, words that confirmed every suspicion, every fear, and when he reached out, when his hand brushed against my shoulder like it had before, I flinched, my body reacting before my brain could, and that reaction, that flinch, made his smirk widen, made his eyes darken with something that sent a wave of nausea rolling through me, and I felt so small then, so helpless, because I was alone, truly alone, and no one knew I was here, no one would question where I had gone, and he knew that, he had planned for that, and I could see it in the way he took his time, the way he stepped just slightly closer, blocking my path, trapping me in this moment, and I knew that if I didn't act now, if I didn't do something, I would lose whatever small sliver of control I still had, and so I forced my voice to work, forced myself to say, "I have to go." But my words came out weaker than I wanted them to, barely a whisper, barely anything at all, and he chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl before saying, "We're just talking," and my breath hitched, my entire body going rigid, because I knew that if I didn't do something now, if I didn't break away, I would regret it, and so, before he could react, before he could close the space between us any further, I moved, shoving past him with a force I didn't know I had, my shoulder slamming into his chest as I stumbled towards the door, my fingers fumbling at the handle, panic making me clumsy. But I managed to wrench it open, managed to spill out into the hallway where the air felt fresher, where I could finally breathe, and I didn't look back, didn't stop running until I was outside, until I was halfway across the field, my chest heaving, my hands shaking, and the realization hit me like a freight train. I had escaped, but barely, and the worst part, the part that made my stomach churn, was that I knew this wasn't over, knew that I couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. But what could I do? Who would believe me? Who would take my word over his? And that was when the true fear set in. The fear of what came next. The fear of knowing that even though I had made it out, I was still trapped, still powerless, because Mr. Carter wasn't done. Not yet. And I didn't know how much longer I could keep running before he finally caught up to me. The night after I fled the locker room, sleep was an impossible concept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my body rigid, my breath shallow, my mind replaying every single second of what had happened, every touch, every glance, every moment that had led up to the sheer panic that had propelled me through that door. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to feel hunted, to feel like prey in a place where I should have been safe. Because this wasn't just about what had already happened, it was about what could still happen, what would happen if I didn't find a way to stop it. But how do you fight a monster that everyone else sees as a mentor, as a respected coach, as someone beyond reproach? How do you stand against someone who knows how to manipulate the system, how to hide in plain sight, how to make sure that no one ever believes the whispers against him? And that was the most terrifying part. No one would believe me, not without proof, not without something tangible, and Mr. Carter knew that, which meant he wasn't worried, meant he wasn't afraid, meant he would try again, and next time, maybe I wouldn't be able to escape, next time, maybe there wouldn't be a lucky interruption or an unlocked door or a chance to run. And as I sat up, my arms wrapping around my knees, the weight of that realization settled over me like a suffocating blanket, but beneath the fear, beneath the bone-deep exhaustion, something else flickered to life, anger. Rage, the kind that burned through the helplessness, the kind that made my hands clench into fists, because why should I be the one who had to live in fear? Why should I be the one who had to suffer in silence while he walked around untouched, free to do whatever he wanted? And that was when I knew. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't just hope that he would stop, because he wouldn't. He never would, not unless someone made him. And maybe that someone had to be me, so I started planning, started thinking, started piecing together a way to make sure that this time, he wouldn't walk away unscathed. And the next day at school, I forced myself to act normal, forced my face into an expression of disinterest, of casual exhaustion, like I had just pulled an all-nighter for an exam and nothing more. But inside, I was calculating, watching, waiting for my moment. And when gym class rolled around, when I stepped onto the field and felt his eyes land on me, that sickening familiarity slithering over my skin, I didn't flinch, didn't let him see the fear anymore, because this time I wasn't just a scared student. I was something else now, something sharper, something dangerous to him, and maybe he sensed it, maybe he felt that shift, because he didn't call on me that day, didn't try to single me out, didn't attempt to corner me, but I knew it was only temporary, knew he was just waiting, just like I was. And then, finally, my chance came, the opportunity one had been hoping for. Because after class I overheard something. One of the other students, a freshman, was asked to stay behind, told to help clean up after practice, and my stomach lurched, because I knew what that meant, knew exactly what Mr. Carter was doing, and I couldn't let it happen, not again. So I made my decision right then and there, made a choice that I knew I could never take back, and I grabbed my phone, slipped into the shadows just outside the locker room, and waited with the camera recording, waited for the moment that would finally be his undoing. And when I heard it, his voice, that same smooth manipulation, that same low coaxing that he had used on me. My grip tightened on the phone, my pulse roaring in my ears, because this was it. This was the proof I needed. And as I stepped forward, as I caught his hand just inches from the freshman's shoulder, the shock on his face was priceless. The split second of panic before he masked it with forced authority. But it was too late, because I wasn't alone anymore. I had backup, had called a friend just minutes before, had told them to meet me there, and when they stepped inside, phone in hand, camera still rolling, Mr. Carter's face changed, his confidence cracking, his mask slipping, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes, saw the realization that he wasn't the one in control anymore, I was. And when I spoke, my voice was steady, stronger than it had ever been, and I said, "You're done." And then, just like that, it was over, because the administration couldn't ignore the video, couldn't cover up the whispers anymore. Not when multiple students came forward, not when the pieces finally started coming together, and Mr. Carter was gone, removed, reported, his reputation shattered. And even though it didn't erase what had happened, even though I still had nightmares, still felt his ghost in empty hallways, still carried the weight of what I had been through, I won, I had taken back control, had refused to be just another victim in his collection. And as I stood outside the school weeks later, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the weight lift just slightly, I knew one thing for certain. I had saved myself, and maybe, just maybe, I had saved others too.